Hey everybody, this is a piece by Raya Dunayevskaya from 1977. It was in the journal Studies in Comparative Communism. The piece is titled Leon Trotsky as Man and Theoretician. Leon Trotsky at no time let subjectivism enter into an analysis of his situation, whether Trotsky was a creator of that situation or that situation's victim. Because of the high tragedy of Trotsky's murder at the hands of an NKVD assassin who drove a pickaxe into the skull of the, quote, man of October, end quote, so called because the day of his birth coincided with the date of the successful Bolshevik Revolution, October 25th, the last years of his life seem to have provided a field day for psychological approaches even on the part of political analysts. Footnote. Isaac Deutscher's massive 3-volume biography of Trotsky notwithstanding, there is yet to appear an objective biography worthy of the man and his times. This is no place to review the prophet armed, the prophet unarmed, and the prophet outcast, but two matters cannot be left unsaid. One concerns Deutscher's many adjectives in praise of Trotsky, but he ends with a Stalinist apologia. Quote, by a feat of history's irony, Stalinism itself, malgré lui, broke out of its national shell, end quote. The second and truly damning point is that the last volume is devoted to the worst and pettiest type of gossip, with hardly a whiff of the life Trotsky lived. Trotsky, the founder of the Fourth International, devoting his life to the Trotskyist parties at the expense of all else, is submerged by Trotsky, the faithful lover of Natalia. End footnote. Sorry, this computer's being difficult. Okay. The present study discusses Trotsky, quote, as man and theoretician, end quote, in order not to add to the myriad writings about Trotsky which claim, quote, subjectivism, end quote, by relating his behavior during the crucial period of the Moscow trials when all the, quote, general staff, end quote, of the revolution was killed off by Stalin, and Trotsky himself was accused of the most heinous crimes. I hope instead to clear the air of such trite characterizations as, quote, great egoist, quote, dictatorial and exacting, end quote, and, quote, arrogant and conceited, end quote. The inadequacies of his theories, unrooted as they are in philosophy, are far too deep for such subjectivism. In the days of Gulag Archipelago publicity, it may seem unnecessary to talk of such truism as Stalin's monolithism, the Lubyanka, and torture. Lubyanka is the popular name for the building which contains the headquarters of the Border Guard Service, an agency of the FSB and its affiliated prison, on Lubyanka Square in the Meshchansky district of Moscow, Russia. Lubyanka is a large neo-Baroque building with a facade of yellow brick designed by Alexander V. Ivanov in 1897 and augmented by Alexei Shusev from 1940 to 1947. Lubyanka was previously the national headquarters of the KGB. Soviet hammer and sickles can be seen on the building's facade. But not only is the Gulag Archipelago 37 years beyond the period I am describing, it is neither the whole truth nor objective history. So let us return to the year 1937 when a lonely exile of the heroic mold of the former Commissar of War is suddenly confronted with the results of the whole decade of Stalin's victory over Trotsky, where Russia uses its state powers, its army, its brutality, and its total disregard for history to fabricate the greatest frame-up in history. It is only through the sympathy of President Cardenas of Mexico that the Mexican press holds open 2 columns of space for a few hours for Trotsky to answer the charges that it took the Stalinist bureaucracy a decade to fabricate. Trotsky never knew what the accusation would be, nor in what year he was alleged to have done this or that. Moreover, the trials had come at a time of the greatest personal grief in the Trotsky family, for the long arm of the GPU had reached out to kill the only living son of Trotsky, Leon Sedov. I believe Leon Sedov was killed in France. In a white Russian emigre hospital. I think he had appendicitis. I'm not sure. It was a predetermined, insidiously planned feat of a master intrigant, calculated to give Trotsky the blow that Stalin hoped would render Trotsky incapable of answering the accusations against himself, which would come in 2 short weeks. Indeed, the death of Leon Sedov inflicted the deepest wound and one in the most vulnerable spot. Leon Davidovich, which is Trotsky, and Natalia Ivanovna locked themselves into their room and would see no one. For a week they did not come out of their room, and only one person was permitted in, the one who brought them the mail and food, of which they partook little. Those were dismal days for the household. We did not see either L.D. or Natalia. We did not know how they fared, and we feared the consequences of the tragedy for them. We moved typewriters, the telephone, and even doorbells to the guardhouse out of sound of their room. Their part of the house became deathly quiet. There was an oppressive air, as if the entire mountain chain of Mexico were pressing down upon this house. The blow was the harder not only because Sedov had been their only remaining living child, but also and especially because Sedov had been Trotsky's closest literary and political collaborator. When Trotsky was interned in Norway, gagged, unable to answer the monstrous charges leveled against him in the first Moscow trials, in August 1936, Sedov had penned Les Livres Rouges, which, by brilliantly exposing the Moscow falsifiers, dealt an irreparable blow to the prestige of the GPU. In the dark days after the tragic news had reached us, when L.D. and Natalia were closeted in their room, Trotsky wrote the story of their son's brief life. It was the first time since pre-revolutionary days that Trotsky had written by hand. On the 8th day he emerged from his room. I was petrified at the sight of him. The neat, meticulous Leon Trotsky had not shaven for a week. His face was deeply lined. His eyes were swollen from too much crying. Without uttering a word, he handed me the handwritten manuscript, Leon Sedov, Son, Friend, Fighter, that contained some of Trotsky's most poignant writings. One passage read, quote, I told Natalia of the death of our son in the same month of February in which 32 years ago Natalia brought to me in jail the news of his birth. Thus ended for us the day of February 16th, the blackest day in our personal lives, ... Together with our boy has died everything that still remained young within us, ... End quote. The very next morning, the papers carried the announcement of the Third Moscow trials, March 1938. Trotsky labored late into the night. One day Trotsky was up at 7 a.m. and wrote until midnight. The next day he arose at 8 and worked straight through to 3 the following morning. The last day of that week, Trotsky did not go to sleep until 5 in the morning. He drove himself harder than any of his staff. Trotsky wrote on average 2,000 words a day. He gave statements to the North American newspaper Alliance United Press, the Associated Press, Havas Agency, the London Daily Express, and the Mexican newspapers. Trotsky's declarations were also issued in the Russian and German languages. The material was dictated in Russian. While I transcribed the dictation, other secretaries checked every date, name, and place mentioned at the trials. Trotsky demanded meticulous objective research work, for the accusers had to be turned into the accused. So unused to subjectivism was this revolutionary that at the very moment of the Moscow trials, he was deeply incensed when the papers printed, quote, rumors, end quote, that Stalin had at no time been a revolutionist, but had always been an agent of the Tsar and was now merely wreaking vengeance. When I brought L.D. the newspapers that carried this explanation of the blood purge, he exclaimed, quote, But Stalin was a revolutionist, end quote. Quote, wait a minute, end quote, he called to me, and as I was leaving the room, quote, we'll add a postscript to today's article, end quote. Trotsky dictated, quote, the news has been widely spread through the press to the effect that Stalin supposedly was an agent provocateur during the Tsarist days and that he is now avenging himself upon his old enemies. I place no trust whatsoever in this gossip. From his youth, Stalin was a revolutionist. All the facts about his life bear witness to this. To reconstruct his biography ex post facto means to ape the present reactionary bureaucracy, end quote. No, Trotsky was not guilty of subjectivism. This does not mean that Trotsky did not suffer from theoretical deficiencies, but these did not stem from subjectivism, a failure to be, quote, dispassionate, end quote. Rather, the analysis of the objective situation, including the objectively grounded reason, of the proletarian forces of revolution was without philosophic roots, and thereby lacked a unifying objective-subjective vision. Since all of Marx's revolutionary theories flowed dialectically from his philosophy of liberation, and since the first appearance of revisionism in Marxian theory, Bernstein, arose by no accident with the demand to have done with, quote, Hegel's dialectic scaffolding, end quote, and to return to, quote, facts, end quote, the latest events, and, quote, Kantianism, end quote, revolutionary Marxists felt a strong need to reassert their, quote, allegiance, end quote, to dialectics and the rejection of, quote, Kantianism, end quote. Trotsky the revolutionary was certainly not guilty of a departure from the class struggle or of depending on, quote, men of goodwill, end quote, to resolve class contradictions. Unfortunately, this did not lead to deep digging into the philosophical origins of Marxism in the Hegelian dialectic. It is here and not in subjectivism that dualism emerged in Trotsky's theory as at its highest point of development, his most original theory, the permanent revolution. The permanent revolution and, quote, conciliationism, end quote. Quote, it will always remain a matter for astonishment how the Kantian philosophy knew that relation of thought to sensuous existence, where it halted for a merely relative relation of bare appearance, and fully acknowledged and asserted a higher unity of the two in the idea, but yet stopped dead, so that it affirmed as true what it proclaimed to be finite knowledge, and declared to be superfluous and improper figments of thought that which it recognized as truth, and which it established the definite notion, end quote. Hegel, Science of Logic, Volume 2. Surely no more brilliant prognostication has ever been made of a historic event, when no Marxists, let alone other theoreticians, projected for Tsarist Russia anything but a, quote, bureaucratic democratic revolution, end quote. Trotsky, at this time a young man of 26 and already head of the St. Petersburg Soviet of 1905, elaborated a theory that the revolution in Russia would continue, quote, in permanence, end quote, i.e. would pass from the bourgeois to the proletarian or socialist stage. Here are the main theses as Trotsky wrote them, quote, in a country economically more backward, the proletariat may come to power sooner than in a country capitalistically advanced, Marxism is above all a method of analysis, not an analysis of text, but an analysis of social relations, We have shown above that the objective premises of socialist revolution have already been created by the economic development of the advanced capitalist countries, It is the purpose of every socialist party to revolutionize the minds of the working class in the same way as development of capitalism has revolutionized social relations, The colossal influence of the Russian Revolution manifests itself in killing party routines, in destroying socialist conservatism, in making a clean conquest of proletarian forces against capitalist reaction a question of the day, ... End quote. This is from, so it says, footnote, it says, see Leon Trotsky, Our Revolution, published by 1918. See also The Permanent Revolution, and, quote, historic references on the theory of permanent revolution, end quote, which is Appendix 3 to Volume 2 of the History of the Russian Revolution. End footnote. Despite the sweeping prediction made with Parvis in 1904 and elaborated into the specifically Trotskyist theory in 1905 to 1906, the theory underwent no, quote, suffering, seriousness, patience, labor of the negative, end quote. That is, it was not fleshed out. Footnote. For a biography of Parvis as well as comments on Parvis's role in the elaboration of the theory of permanent revolution, see The Merchant of Revolution by Z.A.B. Zeman and W.B. Scharlau. See also Deutscher's The Prophet Armed. Another footnote. G.W.F. Hegel, The Phenomenology of Mind. That is, it was not fleshed out to incorporate the actually developing forces for revolution or deepened conceptually to meet the new reality. It was still born throughout the period of 1906 to 1917, as well as after Lenin's death, when Trotsky began claiming it was, quote, proved, end quote. It remained in that condition not only when it was written, not only in the period between 1905 and 1917 revolutions, but also in the period of actual workers' power. Above all, and this is the most telling and authentic manifestation of its failure to undergo objective-subjective dialectical development, i.e. to meet the challenge of new times and new problems, the theory of permanent revolution was never used as a foundation for the establishment of an independent political tendency, grouping, or party. That was true when Trotsky was a Menshevik, when Trotsky considered himself, quote, above, end quote, all, quote, factions, end quote, and tried to, quote, unify, end quote, all tendencies, when he became a Bolshevik in 1917, and then when Trotsky finally called for the creation of a new Fourth International against the Stalinized Third International. When Trotsky lost out to Stalin in the struggle for the mantle of Lenin and wrote My Life on the island of Principe in Turkey, he said, quote, finally, I never endeavored to create a grouping on the basis of the theory of the permanent revolution. My inter-party stand was a conciliatory stand. When in certain moments I strove for groupings, then it was precisely on this basis. My conciliationism was derived from a certain social revolutionary fatalism. I believed that the logic of the class struggle would compel both factions to pursue the same revolutionary line, ... end quote. Trotsky quoted and accepted Lenin's characterization. Quote, conciliationism was represented most consistently by Trotsky, who almost alone endeavored to lay a theoretical foundation for this current, end quote. Was the dualism then only between the decisive, quote, correct, end quote, theory and, quote, derivative, end quote, organizational, end quote, questions? Did it not rather characterize the theory of revolution? Lenin's remarks on conciliationism, written before World War I, were limited to the organizational question, while the pivotal, objective, shocking, all-determining question became philosophic. Why did the Second International collapse at the very moment when the imperialist war broke out? The simultaneity of the two events could not be answered only by pointing to the all-too-obvious betrayal of established socialism. They demanded a re-examination of the very mode of thought which led those who did not betray not to have anticipated such a development, much less to prepare in a totally new way now, quote, to meet destiny, end quote, i.e. to assure the transformation of the imperialist war into a civil war. Or so Lenin, who felt a compulsion to return to the origins of Marxism in the Hegelian dialectic thought. As the abstract of Hegel's science of logic, and all that Lenin wrote and did in the period 1914 to 1924 showed, Lenin had singled out two dialectical principles, quote, transformation into opposite, end quote, cognition not only reflects the world but creates the world, end quote. To prepare himself theoretically for revolution as he worked out a new relationship of the movement from theory to the movement from practice, the experience of the masses. This is not the place to deal with what I consider the great divide in Marxism. Lenin's break not only with the Second International, but with his own philosophic past and the philosophic preparation both for the Russian Revolution and the World Revolution, to enlist, quote, all the toilers to a man in the government of the state, end quote, since, quote, socialism cannot be introduced by a minority, a party, end quote. There's some footnotes here. Footnote 1. I was the first to translate this into English. What's this one related to? That's Lenin's abstract of Hegel's science of logic. It appears in Appendix B to Marxism and Freedom. In 1961, it finally appeared in, quote, official, end quote, translation as, quote, conspectus of Hegel's book, The Science of Logic, end quote, in Lenin's collected works. Next footnote. Elsewhere I have developed this fully. See Chapter 3, The Shock of Recognition and the Philosophical Ambivalence of Lenin, end quote, in Philosophy and Revolution. Okay, that's the end of the footnotes. Here we are concerned with the consequences of Trotsky's failure to re-examine or, for that matter, to apply his theory of permanent revolution. This was so both in 1914 to 1917 and in 1917 to 1924. In 1919 and again in 1923, when his collected works began to be published in Russia, and when 1905, which included, of course, the theory of permanent revolution, was reproduced, the volume also included his wild 1909 attack on Bolshevism. Quote, while the anti-revolutionary aspects of Menshevism are already expressed in full force today, the anti-revolutionary features of Bolshevism threaten to be of great danger only in the event of revolutionary victory, end quote. This was footnoted as follows, quote, as is known, this didn't take place for Bolshevism, which under the leadership of Lenin, though not without internal struggle, accomplished ideological rearmament in this most important question in the spring of 1917, that is, before the seizure of power, end quote. Trotsky. It is true that, except for Lenin, the Bolsheviks were found wanting on the question of making the struggle for proletarian power the order of the day in October, and that Lenin had to, quote, rearm, end quote, the party, and rearmed the party from the moment Lenin returned to Russia in April 1917. It is not true that Trotsky's theory of permanent revolution was, quote, proven correct, end quote, or that the rearming was, quote, belated, end quote, because Lenin was not armed with the theory of permanent revolution. What Lenin was, quote, armed, end quote, with, and Trotsky was not, was having faced the reality of 1914 with a totally new concept of Hegelian dialectics as self-developing, quote, subject. Naturally, Lenin at once, quote, translated, end quote, subject as the masses, proletarian, and peasant. Where Lenin called for, quote, transformation of the imperialist war into a civil war, end quote, Trotsky called for a, quote, struggle for peace, end quote, for, quote, peace without annexations, end quote. Where Lenin called by name for the approval of Liebknecht, who alone voted against granting war credits to the Kaiser, Trotsky led the, quote, internationalist, end quote, at Semmerwald to reject that as a, quote, personification of tactical evaluations conformable to German conditions alone, end quote, and as, quote, inappropriate in the given documents, end quote. And where Lenin, quote, self-development of the idea, end quote, imparted a new urgency to the, quote, principle, end quote, of self-determination of nations by the, quote, dialectic of history, end quote, which makes it possible for small nations to become the, quote, bacilli, end quote, for a proletarian revolution. Trotsky concentrated his fire on calling for, quote, an end to circle exclusiveness, end quote, on, quote, factional insulation, end quote. Now, even if we were willing to skip over the differing theories as to how to fight against the imperialist war as not necessarily related to preconceived theories of revolution, and were to hold that what counts is 1917 and 1917 alone, how does that, quote, prove, end quote, Trotsky's conclusion that the November Revolution, quote, liquidated, end quote, all differences between him and Lenin? Much later, Trotsky was to claim, quote, correctness, end quote, for his theory, not only as it concerned Russia 1917, but also as it concerned China 1927. Quote, the conception of the permanent revolution was confirmed once more, this time not in the form of a victory, but of a catastrophe, end quote. The defeat of the 1925 to 1927 Chinese Revolution by Chiang Kai-shek's counter-revolution was related to Stalin's mistakes versus Trotsky's, quote, correct, end quote, estimation of the peasantry as incapable of, quote, an independent role, even less a leading one, end quote. The lowly role of the peasantry in his concept of the theory of permanent revolution was so all-pervasive that as late as 1937, Trotsky continued to laugh at Mao's claim of having established peasant Soviets. There's a footnote I missed. Leon Trotsky's preface to the original 1930 edition of Harold Isaac's The Tragedy of the Chinese Revolution. Isaacs, who eliminated this from subsequent edition, also took liberties with later editions of his own work. Where am I? Anyway, up to the very end, 1940, Trotsky insisted that he, quote, repeatedly returned to the development and the grounding theory of the permanent revolution, ... The peasantry is utterly incapable of an independent political role, end quote. Footnote, Leon Trotsky, Stalin, published in 1941. For that matter, in the history of the Russian Revolution and after, Trotsky himself shows that the land committees were being transformed, quote, from chambers of conciliation into weapons of agrarian revolution, end quote. He still repeats, quote, this fact that the peasantry as a whole found it possible once more for the last time in their history to act as a revolutionary factor testifies at once to the weakness of the capitalist relations in the country and to their strength. End footnote. We cannot but conclude that Trotsky's words speak louder than any of Stalin's allegations about Trotsky's, quote, underestimation of the peasantry, end quote, and that above all a theory so far removed from the realities of the age of imperialism and state capitalism had to collapse of its own hollowness. Dialectics takes its own toll of theory and on theory. Says of toll of. I don't know. Dialectics takes its own role of theory and theoreticians. The dualism in the theory of permanent revolution resides not in the artificially impenetrable division between proletariat and peasantry, or between theory and organizational, quote, conciliationism, end quote, but in uniting at one moment what the previous moment had declared impossible of unification. At the same time, the lack of a dialectical unifying force is best seen within the theory, precisely on the level that gave it the greatest authority, world revolution versus nationalism. I am not here referring to the struggle against Stalin's concept of socialism in one country, but to the national question within the context of the USSR to be created as an outpost of world revolution which totally preoccupied Lenin on his deathbed. Clearly by now, quote, conciliationism, end quote, was not the issue. Quite the contrary. Lenin had called Trotsky, quote, the best Bolshevik, end quote, and Trotsky himself, now that he had accepted the 1903 concept of the vanguard party, did so without any of the modifications that Lenin had introduced through 1903 to 1923. Footnote. Marxism and Freedom, Chapter 11, Forms of Organization, the relationship of the spontaneous self-organization of the proletariat to the, quote, vanguard party, end quote, end quote. End footnote. It had become a veritable fetish. The concept of the vanguard party? I'm going to reread the sentence. Quite the contrary, Lenin had called Trotsky, quote, the best Bolshevik, end quote. And Trotsky himself, now that he had accepted the 1903 concept of the vanguard party, did so without any of the modifications that Lenin had introduced through 1903 to 1923. It had become a veritable fetish. Moreover, Lenin had fully entrusted him to conduct the fight against Stalin, who acted the great Russian chauvinist against the Georgians. Lenin was too ill to appear at the Congress, and Trotsky was asked to act for him. As Lenin put it, quote, I am declaring war against Russian chauvinism, ... It is said we need a single apparatus. From where come such assertions? It is not from the same Russian apparatus. Is it not from the same Russian apparatus, ... borrowed from Tsarism and only barely anointed with a Soviet chrism, end quote. What the hell is a chrism? A chrism is a mixture of oil and balsam, consecrated and used for anointing at baptism and in other rites of Catholic, Orthodox, and Anglican churches. Footnote. The last edition of Lenin's collected works, Volume 45 as well as Volume 36, has finally reproduced both the will and the disputes on the national question. The original information on and reproduction of these documents were first published by Trotsky in the Stalin School of Falsification. End footnote. To Lenin, the national question was inseparable from internationalism, from proletarian internationalism. What Lenin was agonizing about was that now that the communists were in power, they were acting as imperialists. Quote, scratch a communist and you'll find a great Russian chauvinist, end quote. This bomb he was going to release against Stalin, and indeed it formed the very ground by which in his will he was to ask for, quote, the removal of Stalin, end quote. Once it ended in, quote, conciliationism, end quote, which Lenin most feared and warned against, quote, a rotten compromise. Here in Trotsky's explanation, quote, I do agree with Lenin in substance. I want a radical change in the policy on the national question, a discontinuance of persecutions of the Georgian opponents of Stalin, ... The last thing I want is to start a fight at the Congress for any changes in organization. I am for preserving the status quo, ... I am against removing Stalin, ... There should be no more intrigues, but honest cooperation, end quote. Footnote, Leon Trotsky, My Life. End footnote. Whether that fatal compromise was bound, as Professor Moshe Lewin holds, by, quote, magnanimity, end quote, or was the inescapable result of dualism in theory not grounded in philosophy, was put to the severest test at the time of the Hitler-Stalin Pact after, quote, Trotskyism, end quote, reached Trotskyism's peak both in the proclamation for world revolution and in the establishment of the Fourth International, and yet it also clung to the defense of Stalin's Russia as a workers' state. Thus had Trotsky, who proclaimed, quote, the higher truth, end quote, to be world revolution, stopped dead as Kant had on a different level, at the bare appearance, the very, quote, socialism in one country, end quote, of what he had fought for so bitterly and correctly for 2 long decades. Footnote, I missed, Moshe Lewin's Lenin's Last Struggle, published 1970. Moshe Lewin is like a famous historian of the Soviet Union. He's kind of, as for people that I'm interested in terms of historians of the Russian Revolution, there's kind of a lineage from, I'm not to say that they agreed on everything or like they even had the same ideas, but in terms of just like mentors in terms of like the scholarship, Moshe Lewin taught Stephen A. Smith, or Steve Smith, S.A. Smith, who taught Simon Pirani. The Fourth International and leadership. Apart from whether Trotsky could not fathom or whether Trotsky wished not to fathom the phenomenon of the workers' state being transformed into the workers' state opposite, a state capitalist society, his theory, unrooted as it was in philosophy, had him face reality in the, quote, fixed particular, end quote, of nationalized property, as if that equaled socialism. Footnote. I was the first to analyze the 3 5-year plans in my study of state capitalism in the New International. This series of articles has since been reproduced as Russia as State Capitalist Society, produced by News and Letters. She was just saying that she was the first to study state capitalism. I don't know. Was she the first to study state capitalism? Within the Trotskyist movement, I would say so, probably. But there was also a guy named Ryan P. Farrell who claimed that the Soviet Union was state capitalist, as well as, but there was other people like outside of it, outside of the Trotskyist movement who were saying that. But why the Trotskyist analyses of the USSR, like the new ones that were coming out in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, I find so interesting is that was after Stalin's so-called revolution from above, dekulakization, collectivization, breakneck industrialization associated with the, or not associated, but as part of the 5-year plans. They're analyzing there's a qualitative change in Soviet society in the Stalin period. That using the tools to analyze, using the same like the NEP area and the Stalin period were radically different ideas. So like if people are calling the USSR state capitalist in 1925, that's different than calling it state capitalist in 1935 because there had been so many changes within the society itself. Not that obviously people who were not Trotskyists, so like ultra left people, or like I don't like that word ultra left really, but people to the left of Trotskyism, I liked that description of the ultra left. They had not that they didn't continue to write commentaries on the Soviet Union, but yeah, very much interested in these people who kind of start with Trotskyism and then kind of like step away from it in whatever way, at least step away from orthodox Trotskyism. Anyway, let me reread the last sentence I read. Apart from whether Trotsky could not fathom, or whether he wished not to fathom, the phenomenon of the worker state being transformed into the worker state's opposite, a state capitalist society, his theory, unrooted as it was in philosophy, had him face reality in the, quote, fixed particular, end quote, of nationalized property, as if nationalized property equaled socialism. In any case, Trotsky denied the fact. Yet clearly, just as everything had changed in the private capitalist world once the Great Depression caused its collapse, and it had to accept state intervention and state planning, be it in the form of the so-called, quote, combined development, end quote, as New Dealism, or of total statism as in Nazi Germany, so had everything changed in Stalin's Russia. Though Trotsky himself entitled his most comprehensive analysis of Russia, The Revolution Betrayed, though he knew of the most oppressive conditions of labor, including forced labor, though he had written against Stalin's fantastic scheme of, quote, liquidating, end quote, the peasantry, though he fought the Moscow trials of 1936 to 1938, which had decapitated the whole, quote, general staff of the revolution, end quote, as the greatest frame-up trial in history, and though with a non-existent, quote, socialism in one country, end quote, and existing big power politics, Stalin had reduced the Third International to nothing but outposts for the defense of national Bolshevism. Still, Trotsky denied any change in the class structure of Russia. Trotsky denied the very theory, quote, the first concentration of the means of production in the hands of the state to occur in history was achieved by the proletariat, with the method of social revolution, and not by capitalists with the method of trustification, end quote. The role of totalitarian bureaucracy was defined as that of a policeman arrogating to himself a greater share of the wealth. And because to Trotsky, Stalinist Russia was still considered to be a workers' state, Trotsky held that the Moscow trials had weakened Stalinism. Actually, the Moscow trials consolidated that rule. But to Trotsky, the macabre Kremlin purges only proved that, quote, Soviet society organically tends toward the ejection of the bureaucracy, end quote. Like all fetishisms, the fetishism of state property blinded Trotsky to following the course of the counter-revolution in the relations of production. Trotsky thought of the legitimization of the counter-revolution against October, the Stalinist Constitution of 1936, as merely something that first, quote, created the political premise for the birth of a new possessing class, end quote. As if classes were born from political premises. The struggle against Stalinism had the air of self-defense, not because Trotsky was subjective, but because, objectively, Trotsky saw nothing totally new in world capitalist development, except that it continued to be in its, quote, death agony, end quote. Nothing had changed since Lenin's death except leadership. Stalin was the, quote, organizer of defeats, end quote, and he, Trotsky, could organize victories if the proletariat followed him. This is not meant sarcastically. Trotsky was certainly a leader of the only victorious proletarian revolution in history. Whether as chairman of the Military Revolutionary Committee, which had planned the actual insurrection, as builder of a Red Army out of raw peasant recruits that withstood all counter-revolutionary attack from czarist generals as well as all foreign militarist assault against the newly born worker state, or as commissar of war, or foreign minister or fighter against Stalinism, history will not deny him his victories. No mention of Kronstadt, it's important to note. But that is not the mark of a revolutionary Marxist theoretician whose philosophic perspective charts the course of actual historical development on the basis of a profound analysis of the objective situation, in strict relationship to the subjective development, the new form of workers' revolt, and who, on the basis of the objective and subjective, worked out dialectically a new relationship of theory to practice, in such a way that the philosophy of revolution and the actual forces of revolution do not get separated. But Trotsky, since he never moved away from the fixed particular of nationalized property any more than Kant moved away from the thing in itself, stated in nothing less fundamental than the imperialist war and proletarian revolution, the manifesto of a new Fourth International, quote, to turn one's back on the nationalization of the means of production on the ground that in and of itself it does not create the well-being of the masses, is tantamount to sentencing the granite foundation to destruction on the ground that it is impossible to live without walls and a roof, end quote. The founding conference of the Fourth International, published by the Socialist Workers' Party. End footnote. That was a footnote. End footnote. The man of October could not have fallen deeper into the mire of the ideas and methodology of the Russian bureaucracy, which was presenting instead of theory an administrative formula for minimum cost and maximum production, the true gods of all class rulers. Empiricism does indeed wreak its great... Sorry, I like that actual last sentence a lot. Let me read that again. The man of October could not have fallen deeper into the mire of the ideas and methodology of the Russian bureaucracy, which was presenting, instead of theory, an administrative formula for minimum costs and maximum production, the true gods of all class rulers. Empiricism does indeed wreak its greatest vengeance on Marxist revolutionaries whose universalism sinks to abstract revolutionism disconnected from the self-developing subject, and they get stuck in a fixed particular like nationalized property. Ever since the rise of Nazism and the capitulation to Stalin of the greatest, except of course for Trotsky himself, left opposition, theoretician Christian Rakovsky, Trotsky faced a historic what next. Trotsky answered that what next as if what was required was, quote, 5 years of uninterrupted work to ensure the succession, end quote. Footnote. Leon Trotsky, Trotsky's Diary in Exile, states, quote, after Rakovsky's capitulation there is nobody left, and still I think that the work which I am engaged in now, despite its insufficient and fragmentary nature, is the most important work in my life, for more important than the period of the Civil War or any other. For the sake of clarity, I would put it this way. Had I not been present in 1917 in St. Petersburg, the October Revolution would have taken place on the condition that Lenin was present and in command. The same can by and large be said of the Civil War period. ... Thus, I cannot speak of the indispensability of my work even about the period from 1917 to 21, but now my work is indispensable in the full sense of the word, ... There is now no one except the Second and Third Internationals. I need at least 5 years of uninterrupted work to ensure the succession, end quote. End footnote. If only Trotsky had developed a theory to measure up to the challenge of the times, even if the, quote, cadre, I don't know how you say that. Cadre, I don't know why I don't know how to say that. I'm going to look that up, actually. I've, always said that word wrong. I always said cadre, but then I've heard other people say different words for it. Let's see. What?
Cadre.
Cadre? Like that. Even if the, quote, cadre had not. If only Trotsky had developed a theory to measure up to the challenge of the times, even if the, quote, cadre, end quote, had not. But no, as world crises moved from depression to war and the Hitler-Stalin pact signaled a green light for that Holocaust, Trotsky operated on the basis of the Fourth International Manifesto, once again reducing the entire question to a matter of leadership. Quote, the world situation as a whole is chiefly characterized by a historic crisis of the leadership of the proletariat, end quote, and again, quote, the historical crisis of mankind is reduced to the crisis of the revolutionary leadership, end quote. And once again, for the last time in his lifetime, the organization he founded was not grounded on the theory of permanent revolution, either as he conceived permanent revolution in 1905 to 1906, or without further development as he had seen it, quote, proven, end quote, in 1917 in victory and in 1927 in defeat, or throughout the struggle against Stalin's, quote, socialism in one country, end quote, or when Trotsky finally broke away from being a, quote, left oppositionist, end quote, to something as total as founder of the Fourth International. The duality between the concept of world revolution and that of the defense of Stalinist Russia, between socialism as a classless society that can only realize itself as a world society, and socialism as nationalized property isolated from the world economy, between workers as the vanguard and workers who need to submit to, quote, the militarization of labor, end quote, between, quote, party, end quote, as leader of the proletarian revolution, and, quote, party, end quote, as rulers over workers' own instincts and demands, all these dualities were compounded by, but not limited to, the contradiction between the dialectics of the revolution and the specific subject who constituted the majority of, quote, the masses, end quote, when they happened to be peasant rather than proletarian. No wonder Trotsky ended by, quote, tailgating, end quote, Stalinism, both on the question that he himself first articulated, the state plan, and on that of the, quote, vanguard party to lead, end quote. The greatness of Trotsky, as revolutionary, as historian, and as pamphleteer, will far exceed the quality of his conceptual perceptions, the cognition that gives action its direction. Leon Trotsky as man will tower above Leon Trotsky as theoretician. The end.